Today, we will discuss the refrigeration lab for the Georgia Tech course ME 4056.
Machine Chillers Incorporated requires assistance in modeling their vortex tube-based cooling system. The objective of this lab is to characterize the system components where a refrigerant system cools an aluminum block insulated in styrofoam. The team also will verify the theoretical model with the experimental results, adjusting variables to match experimental conditions. If experimental values are not constant, the model has error. The collected data includes mass flow, pressure, and temperature at pivotal positions within the system. Shown in Figure 1 is the vortex tube upon which the system is based. The steady state relationships between P3 and T4C, P3 and M.C, P3 and T4H, and P3 and M.H were plotted and modeled with input pressures varying between 0 psi, 40 psi, and 80 psi. Each of the positions from which these values come are listed in Figure 2 to the left. The temperature of the system at T4C, T4H, T-load, and T5 for each input pressure were also collected. The steady state relationship between the motor and compressor was then examined by generating at 0 psi, 20 psi, and 40 psi with the motor compressor. Procedure and method for week 2 was quite similar to week 1, but an air compressor was added to the system. The transient cooling of the load was modeled while being cooled by building air and then by the compressor. Steady state data set at 0 psi, transient experimental run at 80 psi, and transient experimental run at 40 psi were all conducted.
For the results portion of this presentation, it will be broken down into several parts. The first part will be going over the vortex tube. The second part will be going over the motor and the compressor. The third part, the heat exchanger and the accumulator tank. And the fourth part, the refrigerated load analysis, ending with the conclusions.
For the first part of this lab, we characterize the vortex tube, which splits air into two streams, a hot stream and a cold stream. Temperature, mass flow, and pressure data is averaged at steady state in order to collect the finalized data as seen in Table 1 here on the right. Note that the data is not in perfect steady state, however. As seen on the plot and on the left, the isolated steady state data can decrease or change somewhat over time. However, this discrepancy is minimal and should not significantly affect results. Now that the steady state data has been collected and averaged, we can actually characterize the vortex tube behavior by seeing how the output hot and cold streams react to an increase in inputted pressure, P3. Generally, the cold air gets colder, the hot air gets hotter, and both streams move faster when P3 is increased, meaning that the efficacy of the vortex tube split increases when the inputted pressure increases as well. Note that only the cold stream flows to the aluminum block for refrigeration purposes. In the overall experiment, the hot stream is discarded into the air.
For part 2 of the results, we are looking to the relationship of the motor/compressor with the pressure over the steady state region. The steady state was captured by isolating the last 100 or so data points, and the speed was calculated using a technique learned in the lab. And the absolute pressure was calculated by averaging the pressure generated, P3, and converting that into newtons per meter squared and adding in the pressure for the atmosphere. After that, we can look into the graph and we can see that with the motor speed increasing, we also see the pressure also increasing. So they have a positive correlation with each other. So as the speed increases for the compressor, the pressure will also seem to increase, which is what we expect to see.
For the heat exchanger and accumulator tank portion of the system, these two stations create an energy change. Using the change in enthalpy equation, where m is the mass flow rate, Cp is the specific heat of air, T3 is the output temperature, and T1 is the input temperature, the energy rate of change was calculated for each trial at different pressures, as shown in the table. This data was then given a linear fit, which resulted in the equation where change in enthalpy is equal to negative 0.65 times the pressure plus 2.03, as shown in the figure on the right. Continuing to look at the heat exchanger and accumulator tank outputs, the effects of the two stations are evident. The figure on the left shows how the output pressure of the stations are constant and not pulsing. This means the accumulator is working well. The figure on the right shows how the input to air temperature of the different pressure trials are all brought down to the same ambient temperature, which means the heat exchanger is working properly. These two stations are necessary because otherwise the vortex tube would have unstable inputs.
So to analyze the thermal properties of the load and the insulating materials, we performed an experiment at steady state. An aluminum block inside the styrofoam box was used as a load to the refrigerator. A pretty large assumption was made for this experiment. It was that all heat passes into the block through the styrofoam, which is to assume that the box was closed. The heat transfer into the air in the cycle is equal to the heat transfer out of the surrounding environment once mass has reached its resting temperature. This heat transfer is described by the equation on the right, where the heat transfer rate is equal to the specific heat of the air times the mass flow rate of the air times the temperature difference before and after. And those values are shown in the table for the range of pressure tests. So from these values, we can calculate the thermal resistance of the styrofoam block. The theoretical value can be found using the geometry, the length and the area here, and the thermal conductivity constant K. The value there is calculated to be 24.75 Kelvin seconds per joule. And on the other hand, the experimental value, which is calculated using the change in temperature over the heat input, is listed there in the table. And these values are much lower than the theoretical value, which indicates that our assumptions were probably pretty faulty.
The main system characterization takeaways are as follows. The vortex tube more effectively splits into hot and cold air streams as inputted pressure P3 increases. Number 2, the generated compressor pressure P3 increases with motor speed with a gain of 0.09. Number 3, the accumulator tank and heat exchanger are necessary for the system to behave stably. Number 4, the refrigerated load, R insulated experimental is equal to 0.67 against a theoretical value